Today we have a story about moonshining to tell from the Carolinas. Come along with us as we tell you about the Queen of the Moonshiners. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is another one of the Stories of Appalachia.
You know, I'm glad we're bringing up a story about a Carolina moonshiner. We talk a lot about West Virginia, particularly when we talk about Franklin County. I mean, that's always been a big thing, talking about Franklin County. But, you know, when we think of North Carolina, we don't necessarily think of the Queen of the Moonshiners. We often think of, or at least some of us that's older, not trying to date you or anything, but some of us think of Junior Johnson hauling moonshine out of the Carolinas back and forth.
Yes.
So here we are, and we're talking about a woman much along the line of maybe a Mahalia Mullins that lived down in, down there on top of the mountain there in Upper East Tennessee. And here she is. She's the Queen of Moonshining in North Carolina.
Well, this lady's kind of interesting. She has quite a story to tell, and that's what we're going to tell you about today. Her name is, Nora Elizabeth Bettie Simms. She just decided to go by Betty. She is, let's just say she was an attractive woman, Rod, and she used her appearance to her benefit. How about that?
That was probably a plus for her.
Yes, it was. Well, here's the story, folks. Miss Nora Elizabeth Betty Henderson, that's her maiden name, her life was one of struggle and resilience. Now, she was born in, you'll like this, Rod, Hooten Owl Holler in Polk County, North Carolina in 1877. Her story, one that echoes through the mountains of western North Carolina. Now, Betty's early years were marked by hardship. In 1894, she married a man named Taylor Simms. Betty and Taylor had 6 kids. They were Mossy, Harvey, Evan, Hetty, and Hattie, who were twins, and Brownlow, the youngest, who was born in 1903. The couple had problems, though, stemming from, Taylor Simms drinking. He got in the habit of abusing Betty, and by the time Brownlow was born, she was ready to move on from Mr. Simms.
Well, Steve, Betty took the children and left, moving back home to the family farm with her parents. She realized that she was going to need something to have some sort of income to provide for her children. So she decided to take up the craft of, you guessed it, moonshining, which some would say she picked up from her husband, who was himself a moonshiner. Well, she did a little figuring, as a lot of females are good at being able to put figures together, math and so forth, realizing that most men, they figured this out, came to the sum of this, most men loved whiskey. She knew from the husband's activities what folks would pay for moonshine, and then decided that there was some pretty good profit in it. Before long, the pretty housewife and mother had transformed herself into a full-fledged moonshiner, armed and ready to defend her business, which, brought her a really good income.
Oh, yeah, it sure did. And not only that, as often happens when you're involved with a profitable, illegal enterprise, sooner or later the law comes a-knocking. And in February of 1906, Betty Simms traveled to Rutherford County to make a sale of 9 barrels of untaxed whiskey. There she encountered not a buyer, but 3 police officers who attempted to arrest her. Betty pulled out her pistol and ran straight for the nearby South Carolina state line, yelling for help. And help arrived very quickly. 5 armed men, fellow moonshiners, had been hidden in the woods just over the border in South Carolina. They stepped out into the open to confront the 3 officers. What happened next isn't what you'd expect, though. These 5 promised the police that Betty would appear in court, and to seal the promise, the 5 each handed the officers $25 as bond for her appearance. The officers took the money, and they went back to North Carolina.
Say what? They went and the five handed the officers $25 to serve as
Yeah.
bond.
Yeah, I was figuring they were going to have a gun battle, but no, they just said,
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. No, she'll show up, folks. Here's $5 a piece from us, $25 to ensure she'll be there. That's what they did.
Maybe it was a group of satisfied customers. I don't know about this, but still, let's go on. On the appointed day, Bettie Simms made her appearance in court on charges of selling moonshine. Well, in the courthouse, well, just like Steve said earlier, Bettie was a striking figure, drawing attention with her grace and attire. Now, that's a far cry from Mahalia Mullins, who was pretty blunt and to the point and could not be moved. At least we know Bettie could move with grace and had nice attire on. She was a woman of divine beauty amid the blandness of legal proceedings, and I'm sure they were back in those days. Her first day there, she was reported to have worn a blue silk gown with a long train and a matching hat. Whew, like something out of Miss America. Well, anyway, she also had a cheek full of snuff, and I've known a few women that's put snuff in their mouth before. They've enjoyed it. Anyway, let's go on. Each day when she arrived, she was noted to be wearing a different fashionable outfit, almost like she was a model walking the runway. Reporters and court onlookers were quite smitten. I bet you they were, those dirty old men, with the pretty young moonshiner. Notably, though, the judge was, well, unaffected by her charm. He commented that such women as Bettie were, quote, a menace to society, end quote, and needed to be punished to the full extent of the law.
That stuffy old man.
That's right.
Well, when Bettie heard that comment, she decided to skip the next day's proceedings, earning her an arrest and 6 months in the county jail. And Rod, here's where it gets interesting. Bettie was not the least bit happy to be sitting in a jail cell, especially since she was away from those kids of hers. She gave some thought about how to rectify the situation, so to speak, and came up with a plan with some assistance from another prisoner named Ed Church. Now, Ed was in jail on a 12-month sentence for manslaughter for the killing of his brother-in-law in a drunken fight. He was awaiting transfer to the state penitentiary to serve out his sentence, and as you can imagine, he too wanted out. Now, in those days, mattresses were often filled with straw, and such was the case with the bedding at the jail. Either Bettie or Ed, were not sure which one, took some of the straw out of a mattress and set it on fire against the wooden door to the cell. The door caught on fire in a place next to the straw and burned through, and once that happened, Ed and Bettie scrambled through the opening and were able to get a window open, giving them an escape route onto the jail porch roof. Ed made it out first, jumped down, and left as fast as his legs would carry him.
Well, Bettie wasn't so lucky. She decided to take the stairs instead of the window, much more of a womanly thing to do. So doing so had her running right through the jailer's apartment of all places, where he was sleeping. Unfortunately for Ms. Simms, well, you guessed it, she woke up the jailer who tried to stop her. Well, Bettie grabbed a knife, she saw it, and proceeded to cut the jailer before he managed to overpower her. He was cut up pretty badly, but he managed to force her back into the cell, Bettie yelling at the top of her lungs to be let go. Well, Bettie, too, was injured in the fight, winding up in bed for a few days to recuperate, all of which the newspapers happily reported to their readers in great detail. The incident made Bettie Simms a bona fide, and I say it that way, a bona fide celebrity, gaining the nickname the Queen of the Moonshiners. Bettie sat in the Polk County jail until December.
Well, that month she made an appearance before the federal court in Charlotte in her federal moonshining case, and there she was interviewed by a reporter who asked her about her escape attempt. Now, Bettie denied setting the jail on fire, saying she left the jail area because, well, it was so hot due to the fire that good old Ed had set, throw Ed under the bus, where she encountered the jailer who forced her back up to the jail cell. Well, in the end, the Queen of the Moonshiners was found guilty of selling moonshine, but the judgment was suspended because she'd already served more than enough time in the county jail. She returned home to Polk County, where she continued to practice her chosen profession. In 1907, Betty moved to Spartanburg, South Carolina, where she put her three oldest kids, now teenagers, to work in the local cotton mill. Taylor Simms, who Betty hadn't divorced, died in November 1915. And don't you know, Rod, a month later, Betty married Frank Giles, her live-in boyfriend of 4 years and fellow moonshiner. What a coincidence.
And, well, with that, Bettie Simms, Giles, faded from the spotlight, and little is known of her after her move to South Carolina. But in March of 1922, she passed away of ovarian cancer at her home. She was 44 years old. She's buried in the Green Creek First Baptist Cemetery in Polk County, North Carolina. What an interesting story about her.
She was certainly the queen of the moonshiners, and
yes,
buddy, she knew it, and she acted like it too, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, she was fetchable. Now, certainly
yeah,
she was fetchable.
She was.
And
indeed.
unfortunately, she was catchable too. I mean, she got caught by the the jailer up there in the apartment. But yeah, this is one of those things too. Now, going back to that headline in there where it said something about the fact of, it was she'd returned to her chosen profession and so forth, and the everything about the newspapers and so forth. I guess this was one of those things too, prior to what we've talked about before about how women were treated in cases such as this. I mean, this was probably, well, I guess it would be. This was a man's profession, but you had a female going out making money out of it, and it seemed like that they were ready to take her down at any cost was what they were going to do. But she had a family to support. That's what she was doing it for.
Well, that's true. And the way the newspapers covered this, I thought was interesting. I mean, it wasn't so much what she did, it was what she looked like, how she dressed, how she held herself. The fact that the men in the courtroom were just in awe of her. Well, everybody but the judge, but the men in the courtroom were in awe of her and her beauty. And she knew that, and she played it to the hilt. All the way up through that escape attempt. And, it served her some good. I mean, she ended up not serving a whole lot of time out of the whole thing.
Yeah, but unfortunately, she was 44 years old. That's a very young age, or at least I look at it that way now. But back in the 20s, that was probably, well, for some, that was very lucky. You were very lucky if you made it to that age or a little bit older. But sad to say, though, that one thing about ovarian cancer, that's the thing that kind of jumps out at me and stuff. You would think, an accident, heart attack or something like that. But ovarian cancer, and she passed away of it at her home. It's a sad way to end, but she lived a fun-loving life, that's for sure.
She had quite a story, and folks, that story is another one of the stories of Appalachia, the story of the woman dubbed the Queen of the Moonshiners, Bettie Simms. Now be sure to subscribe to the Stories podcast. We're available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Until next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.